And how we doing, everybody? Hello. Welcome to another episode of Monster Territory. How are we doing? And I'm not alone here tonight. We got a very special guest. We have John Bitzer of Baseball Trade Values. John, how you doing, my friend? Welcome to the show.
Doing all right, Robbie. Happy to be here. How are you?
Oh man, it's getting a little wackadoodle out there as of late. I know you keep up with all the trade talk and everything over there
Yep.
on Baseball Trade Values. I'm sure the one that you're seeing the most as of right now when it comes to the trade boards over on your site probably involves a name with Nolan Arenado. Is that the case going on right now
You
over on
got
the
it. That's
site?
probably the number one mock trade player that we see. A lot of those. Yeah. It's naturally because he's in the news a lot lately.
Yeah, it's funny because we go back to the start of my main channel, and we were talking Nolan Arenado and the Rockies, right? That was kind of one of the first big stories.
Yep.
Minus you had Mookie Betts and everything back then when BaseballTradeValues.com got started. That was the Mookie going to the Dodgers and everything, but Nolan Arenado, the whole $50 million thing, people just couldn't wrap their heads around it, but you guys did a great job at explaining that whole thing. And here we are. Arenado could be possibly coming to my team. It's funny how things come full circle like
Yep.
that.
Yep.
It's just a very interesting time. Before we dive in, we're going to dive into all of this tonight. Everyone, if you are with us here live on YouTube, hit that like button for us. Subscribe if you're new. We're trying to get to 3K by opening day. And if you are with us in podcast format, whether that's Google, Stitcher, Spotify, whatever, leave us a 5-star review. It really helps out with the algorithm. And John, let's kind of talk real quick, just for the people that are unfamiliar with baseball trade values. Give them a quick rundown. What do you got going on over there?
So, we're a site that projects what each player's trade value should be based on the concept of surplus value. So what are they worth? If they were a free agent, what would they be worth? And then compare that what they actually are making. If there's a difference, that's what's called a surplus. If what they're actually making is a surplus, if they're worth less, then it's a negative surplus, which, since you mentioned Nolan Arenado, is the case. So his contract is a bit underwater. So it's not like he's a bad player. But in our site, for example, we have him over the next 3 years of his contract. He's worth about $44 million, but he's owed about $61 million in present value dollars. So there's a negative 16 something ish, negative surplus, if you will. So anyway, we run those numbers, and we have a platform where you can subscribe and make all the mock trades you want based on all the players. And so there's thousands of them, of course. We got them all. So it's fun.
Yeah, I've been using it now for 5 years. I still remember when I first signed up, and I feel like this happens to a lot of people. I'm telling you, John, I've had people DMing me on Twitter almost the same exact thing multiple times. I hated that site at first. I couldn't stand it, but now I'm starting to understand it a little bit.
That's that's the number one thing, because I even fall prey to that sometimes myself, because you're naturally thinking, okay, good player must be worth a lot, and you're not thinking about the contract or the terms of how many years of control they have. But all of that matters, right? As you know, right? The money matters, the years of control matter, and so when you put them in that context, that number, it looks funny to people when they first look at it. Like, what? Shouldn't that guy be worth more than that? Because he's good. And so it's sometimes hard to get your head around it, but once you do, like, oh, then it all starts to fall into place.
Yeah, it's very interesting. I was that way at first as well. I remember looking at all these numbers. I'm like, what? Why is
I know,
this guy a negative? Like, why is
right?
Mike Trout negative 50? I'm like,
Right.
he's Mike Trout. But then it makes you think about, the economic side of it, the front office point of view, the contracts, right? The projections moving forward, the injury history,
Exactly.
the age, there's so many
Exactly.
factors, that go into it. So,
Yeah.
um,
Yeah. So we're trying to mimic what our front offices are doing, and we talked to front offices, and they validated that that's more or less what they're doing. So they use us primarily as a benchmark. They all have their own numbers, but we're all kind of using similar systems, right? Everyone's looking at what the player is going to do going forward, not necessarily what they've done in the past. What they've done in the past informs that and gives you a good sense of it. But in the case of Arenado, for example, he's getting older, so his numbers are going to go down, down, down each year. You have to project that based on his age. So they're all doing that, right? And so, in fact, when the first Nolan Arenado trade happened a few years ago, as you recall, it shocked a lot of people because we had him at minus 44, I think it was, and as it turns out, the Rockies had to kick in $50 million just to get anything back, which validated the fact that his contract was underwater. And it surprised a lot of people because they thought, oh, he's a good player. They weren't thinking about the contract, and they weren't thinking about what's going to happen at the end of that contract when he gets older. Now, here we are a few years later, and that's exactly what's happening.
Yeah, I still, the one talking point, it was being shared all over social media at that time, was the Rockies are such a terrible franchise that they gave up $50 million along with Arenado. But, we've talked about this before too, where the big mistake that they made was signing him to the extension Correct. In the first place, right? They did the right thing to get out of the contract, but that's unfortunately that was kind of a misconception at the time. I feel like you're not hearing that this time around when it comes to Arenado. It's funny how over time, now you start to see people go, "Oh, Arenado, he's the batted ball metrics, they're terrible. People are treating him like he's 65 years old." Basically. And it's funny how the tides have turned, 4 years later. It's a completely different story now. We got some breaking news. Nick Pivetta going to the Padres. 4 years,
they needed another
55. Starter. Wow, the Padres actually spent some money. I didn't expect that. That's interesting.
Yeah.
Hey, good
they've got a new control person, right? For the longest time, AJ Preller basically did not know who his boss was. Now he does. Now he's got a budget. Now he can do stuff. So good for him.
Yeah, very interesting. Red Sox legend Nick Pivetta heading to the Padres. Breaking news at this moment. But we are here to talk about Nolan Arenado. And we talked about the Rockies aspect of it a few years back. But now let's talk about the Red Sox aspect of it. Now, just catching up everyone to speed on the latest news on Arenado. This is from Alex Spear of the Boston Globe this morning. As of Tuesday night, there was not an agreement on the parameters of a trade. There are conversations about how much of the remaining $64 million on Arenado's contract over the next 3 years. Now, the Rockies are covering $10 million of that, of the $74 million. So 64 right. Coming from the Cardinals, would be covered by St. Louis in a deal whose primary appeal to the Cardinals would be salary relief with modest prospect return. We also got this from Katie Wu of The Athletic. And she's saying here that when it comes to Arenado, she also had some comments today from John Mozeliak. I'll share those in just a second. But she says here, the teams would also have to agree on financial terms, and St. Louis, according to league sources, has stood firm on the amount of money they're willing to cover. Now, if you go back a little ways, when the Astros supposedly had a deal ready to go, it looks like $15 million, according to the reports, was on the table that was going to be covered on that contract. So I would imagine, who knows, that could be a similar amount this time around, which is funny because on Baseball Trade Values, when it comes to his value, I think it's right around $16 million.
Yeah.
So that lines up with that report.
Right.
With this deal, it's going to be very interesting how it turns out, right? I would imagine, there's going to be some money involved if it happens, of course. Who knows? This whole thing could be like A-Rod to the Yankees or A-Rod to the Red Sox after the 2003 season. Who knows? Maybe it could, just fall dead at some point. But I would imagine if it does get done, there's going to be some cash involved. You're probably going to have more than just, or potentially more than Arenado coming back to the Red Sox, maybe to help cover up some more of that negative value. I would imagine from the Red Sox, probably not going to be huge prospects going back to the Red Sox. There has been reports that prospects like Nazan Zanatello, Blaze Jordan, who also put out an interesting tweet today. Basically, it was, I guess you could say, a bit of a cryptic tweet where, basically suggesting that, he's not worrying about right now. He's just getting ready right now to help him, for his future, basically. Interesting tweet from Blaze Jordan today. But he's a name that's popped up. there's been some other interesting little, I don't want to say actual, weird little sources out there over on social media. You never know who's got what, but names like Ivan Herrera have popped up possibly. I'm not sure what the legitimacy of that is, but it's a name that is just floating around. So I'm presenting all these things to you right now, John. What do you think in the end, based on all the trades that you've seen over the years and kind of wrapping your head around this, what do you think would be the appropriate trade here with Arenado to the Red Sox?
So we have a featured trade on our site right now, which looks like, I'm going to answer that question. That's the most likely. So we have Nolan Arenado at minus 16.6. And so let's say the Cardinals kicked in 18 million in cash, roughly 6 million a year, right? So now you're at, if you do the math there, you're slightly above water. You're like at 1.4 going to the Red Sox. And so the Red Sox, in return, give you one or two minor prospects. Blaze Jordan and Zanatello, as you mentioned, are between them, they total 2.6. So you got 2.6 going one way, 1.4 going in. That's very close. So I think that's a pretty reasonable framework here, because I think the Cardinals also have sort of indicated that they're more interested in the salary relief than the prospect value coming back. Now, obviously, if they kicked in more cash, they could get more prospect value back, and that creates a whole other sort of interesting sort of scenario where the Red Sox might give up something more meaningful in prospect. But those two names we just threw out there, are not, top prospects. They're sort of in the middle, lower tiers, right?
Yeah,
so
yes, in the 30s on the updated Baseball America rankings within the Red Sox system. I think Zanatello is number 31 as of right now, and Blaze Jordan is 37. So mid-range.
Yeah. So in other words, it's not a painful loss from the Red Sox point of view. They're just taking on the money. So I think the better way to look at it from the Red Sox point of view is they're getting a third baseman for 3 years, the last 3 years of his contract. You're getting really solid defense, a declining bat, a guy who's 34, 35, 36 in those periods. But the money is a little bit more fair. So, and that covers it up. The other thing is, from a luxury tax point of view, I think Boston can afford it because they're enough under it. So they're one of the few teams that isn't really concerned about that at this point. And I know they've been in the Bregman rumors as well. The thing about that, when you compare Arenado and Bregman, is Bregman wants more years and more money. So Arenado is sort of the cheaper version of that, if you will. You don't get him for as many years. You don't get him for as much money, assuming St. Louis kicks in. And so it's a little bit more of a bargain deal, right? And you're not giving up much in prospects. So that's the appeal from the Boston point of view as well.
Yeah, and that's where, it's interesting seeing all this stuff about the money, where it seems like, maybe the Red Sox they're trying to get the Cardinals to maybe throw in a bit more money. I would imagine at this point, I don't know, like if the Cardinals are looking for salary relief, and honestly, when you factor in that salary relief, I mean, his AAV is going to be around probably 15 million at that point. You're getting a pretty affordable player at that point. Right. And this is another aspect I want to ask you as well. Now, when it comes to, every team out there, you got 30 teams and they all have different philosophies. Now, in this case, where, on the site right now, the median value is negative 16, right around there. But when to factor on your site, to factor in for, different philosophies out there, you guys do a range where do you see the Red Sox where maybe they see a bit more value in Arenado, even though there has been some regression in the bat over the last couple of years? Do you think maybe they see some more value there because maybe his bat could fit pretty well at Fenway Park? Kind of like Mike Lowell going back to 2006 when they brought him in, had a bad year in 2005, but then all of a sudden, the Green Monster there really helped him out. Started getting a lot more doubles there, a little bit more pop. Do you think that could be a situation here with how the Red Sox could be valuing him?
Maybe. I think you can make that case, and that's a reasonable point because you can hit a lot of doubles off the monster and so on. So, but at the same time, when you look at it from a negotiation standpoint, who else are they? Who's in the running here? They don't want to negotiate against themselves, right? Because there's not really a plausible case for any other team at this point. And the Cardinals are kind of desperate. They've signaled this very publicly. They've been trying to trade him for a while. They have no leverage, right? So Craig Breslow is basically, well, we're not going to overpay here, even though he may be a better fit here than he is there or wherever. So like they're not going to, they're not going to negotiate against themselves. So I think that's a non-factor. In other words, because if you're the only team they're talking to, realistically, and I know there's been other teams that have sort of been mentioned in the press, but I think those were because those were the ones that Arenado said, yeah, I would go to the Padres, but the Padres are not in this game. They got Machado and they don't have the money for it. So like, no. Yeah. So there's a difference between what teams Arenado would play for and what teams actually want him. And right now, it looks like the Red Sox are the only ones who have a plausible case for wanting him. So they're not going to negotiate against themselves. And by the way, that whole no trade clause is a real factor here. So not only do the Cardinals have no leverage, but they're also limited in the teams, and they're basically down to one. So like, that's another reason why his value is negative, because even if you could make a case that he should be worth more, there's no leverage here at all.
Well, could you see, because of the leverage, right? And yeah, that's very true, right? The Cardinals are basically backed into a corner here where, I mean, they've said repeatedly, and what did Mozeliak say? Option 1, option 2, option 3 is to trade Nolan Arenado. It's like, that's basically just desperation at that point. And, maybe the Yankees have made a phone call at some point, but they got guys they could turn to already. The Padres, I mean, you don't really need Arenado there. The Mets at one point were a possibility. The Tigers popped up at one point, but really the one that makes the most sense is the Red Sox. And yes, you're going to have that conversation with Rafi Devers at some point. And Cora, he keeps touching on that, right? He said that to me when I talked with him, where he said, if there's ever any kind of a move, where he is the first person you talk to. And I would imagine Rafi, who, I think we can all agree, the bat is what does the talking with him. If he were to ever give up his spot in the infield for anyone, it's probably Arenado, I would imagine. I mean, a Hall of Fame third baseman down the road. But I want to ask you this about, when it comes to the leverage, could you maybe see a situation where the Red Sox, the Cardinals, they're saying, all right, listen, this is kind of where we're at when it comes to the money. Could you see maybe the Red Sox maybe sort of pivoting in a way, and they say to the Cardinals, okay, well, if that's kind of what you're willing to do when it comes to eating the contract, well, how about you give us this player as well? Maybe a Ryan Helsley or an Ivan Herrera. You'd have to get pretty spicy if you included someone like him. Do you think there's a possibility that it could get pretty wacky by throwing in another player along with Arenado?
It could, and never say never, because the math is the math, right? So if they're taking an underwater contract, they either want money as compensation for that to kind of reduce that negative value, or the player equivalent. In essentially, you're talking about a barter here. That's what most trades are. So Helsley would close that gap, a bit, quite a bit actually. I think he's at like 13 in surplus, and so maybe it's Helsley and $5 million or something like that. Or if you had Herrera, he has a bright future and years of control, and he's already kind of established now that he can hit. So like that, he's in the 30s on our site. So now you're talking about the pendulum swinging the other way. Like, oh, that's too much going to Boston. So now Boston has to give up something more of value. Now it's where Casas comes into the conversation, for example. So then it gets really complex, because now you're moving a lot of pieces around and you're doing a lot of math. And I don't know at this stage, where we're so close to spring training, if that complexity is in the cards. I think at this point, it's probably the simpler the better.
Yeah, I would think if it's ever going to get crazy, this is the week where you got to do it, right? Before full squad workouts begin next week. It feels like there is momentum building to some kind of a deal at this point. Pitchers and catchers reported today. You got guys all over Major League Baseball reporting today. But, we still have this week left. But that's kind of where I'm at, too. I think it's probably going to end up being a bit more simple than we think. Maybe, a couple other players that, who knows, like guys in the system where you're like, who's that guy, right? And maybe, another player or two gets thrown in at some point. I'd be pretty shocked if they included someone like Helsley, because I just did a trade video earlier on my main channel, coming up with way too early trade predictions. I could see the Cardinals wanting to hang on to Helsley, seeing what some of these relievers got, at the trade deadline this past year, like Tanner Scott, for example, right?
Yeah.
Helsley, my goodness, like if he's pitching like he did last year, he can get an absolute haul. When it comes to Helsley, I mean, would you, if you were to kind of lean one way or the other, would you say he's probably going to be staying in St. Louis?
So the thing about Husley is he's so good that you could QO him and give him a qualifying offer, I should
Yes.
say, at the end of the year, which would, assuming he turns it down, would get you a draft pick. So you have to add that into the mix, right? So then you compare that, do a side by side comparison. That's what another team would give up more because they get Helsley for a year and a draft pick. So they're thinking, okay, that's a good deal, and I'd pay a lot in prospect capital for that versus what you would get at the deadline where you're only getting him for 2 months, maybe a little bit more if you're a playoff team, and you're not getting the draft pick. Now, having said that, it balances out because the trade deadline is its own animal, and there's no other option to pivot to. If you need to acquire a player, that is your only avenue. You can't, there's no free agents at that point of the year, right? So it's only the trade market, and every team knows that, which is why you get overpays for the Tanner Scotts of the world. So Helsley could easily, I don't think it's going to be more, because when you compare those two scenarios, they're pretty even. So I think it's 50-50 to either trade him now or trade him at the deadline. Either way, they're going to get value back.
Yeah, well, we'll just have to wait and see how this goes. But like we both said, I feel like you're probably just going to see Arenado and some cash, maybe a couple of those mid-range prospects. Maybe the Cardinals kick in another guy, to make up for maybe not wanting to, or I want to say another guy, but maybe another prospect or something like that to kind of make up for some of that value. That's another thing with Breslow too, is he really finds some good value, right? There's similarities there with Heim. And that's another thing too. Do you find that interesting where Heim, being with the Cardinals now, obviously he was just with the Red Sox for so long, and there's the two guys that have been mentioned, Blaze Jordan, Nazan Zanatello, they were drafted under Heim's regime. Do you find that interesting when it comes to this, this whole saga?
I do a little bit because, that's the one area where like everybody's got systems and models and the public information is all out there. And so the only area really of competitive advantage is knowing the inside outs of your prospects, right? And Bloom drafted these guys and knew how they were developing. That's a competitive advantage. So he might think to himself, I can get more out of these guys than perhaps other people might know. So I think there's a little bit of that going on. So yes, we all kind of, see the information out there with prospects, but that's the one area where it's a little murkier, where the inside knowledge is a little bit more skewed towards if you know the guy, you may have something. So I can see that.
Yeah, that's where, there were a couple accounts out there. I believe an account, I think I'm going blank on his title, but he's with Prospects Live. I'm going blank on the name, but he's one of the head guys there. And he put something out a little while back, like over a month ago, that he had heard Casas, his name came up at one point, which didn't surprise me because, he had, gotten to know Heim over the time. And obviously, Heim is, he liked Casas a lot. So it's going to be interesting, but we'll just have to wait and see.
Casas has a lot of value. He's in the high 20s on our side, as you know. So, like, when you throw out that kind of, value, then that's where it gets complex. And then you have to send a lot of value too. Then you're doing a lot of moving and shaking here. And that's where, like I said earlier, I think at this point, it's probably not going to be that complex. If it does happen, and probably will, it's going to be something similar, cash plus a couple minor prospects going back.
Yeah, really the only way I could see Casas being involved, which I don't see him being involved. He's gone very quiet over the last month. It felt like every day we were hearing something about Casas. And I'm not even exaggerating that. There was some kind of a new story, whether it's from Boston Globe, Mass Live, whatever. Casas was coming up constantly. But that's the only scenario where I could see Ivan Herrera being included, because you get pretty close to the values at that point. But again, I feel like it's probably going to end up being more simple than we think. Maybe a couple other prospects involved at the end, but that's it's going to get interesting. But John, we are going to wrap it up right there. Pretty quick show for tonight. I do want to thank you for coming on. Let the listeners know what's going on over at Baseball Trade Values. Tell them about the site real quick, how they could sign up for it and whatnot.
Yeah, just come to the site, Baseball Trade Values. We always make 2 teams free on our simulator. But if you want to subscribe, make all the trades you want, the prices start at $24.99 a year, which is about $2 a month. So it's easy. It's a lot of fun. You get to comment with a bunch of other people who are interested in making trades. And so, you can pretend to be the GM of your favorite team. And that's the idea.